Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time poor but enthusiasm rich primary teachers. This week, we're joined by Jon Cripwell. Hi, Jon. How are you?
Hi, Kieran. Yeah, I'm very well, thanks. How are you?
Yeah, all good. Thank you. And we're going to focus our attention on sustaining meaningful change in schools. But first, Jon, I thought it might make sense to start with a little bit about where you're from and how you got here today.
Yeah, absolutely. So, teaching was not my first vocation. I sort of avoided it as much as possible. I never wanted to be a teacher when I was at school. Uh, but I went to university and studied law and loved all the academic side of things, but found the job, the bit that I was doing anyway, which was kind of on the corporate side, a little bit stale and not how I wanted to spend my life. And in the years in between, I met my wife, who happened to be a teacher. I got very fed up of having to go to work every day for 6 weeks while she stayed in bed. And no, she's, we thought that we needed a change, and I went and started working at a secondary school in the DT department as a learning support assistant, as they were back then. This is about 20 years ago. And I was lucky to get that job on the back of having worked at home base and used a circular saw when I was at uni. So I was set up there, really enjoyed working in the school, really enjoyed working with the kids and things, and happened to have one of those conversations that just happen with a member of staff who'd said that if he'd had his time again, he'd have taught primary. And my wife was a primary teacher. I hadn't really thought about it before, but I thought that, yeah, okay, that makes sense. So I'm not teaching the same thing every day, which looking back now, all those lesson plans for different lessons and things that you go over during the weeks and things. Maybe that would have been a little bit easier if I had been teaching the same thing every day. But yeah, I changed and did my PGCE in primary, and absolutely loved working in primary. Spent a lot of my teaching career over 15 years, 16 years in upper key stage 2, because once you, I'm sure you know, Kieran, once you end up in year 6, it's quite difficult to extricate yourself from there. And most of that time as well, I spent as a maths lead. Not because initially I loved maths. At school, I hated maths. Actually, I didn't understand it. I didn't have that conceptual understanding that Pete Mattock talks about, I think, on your show recently. For me, it was very procedural. I just had to try and remember facts and procedures and get through it. And so when I had my last maths lesson at 16, I thought I was done with maths. But it turned out that teaching it became a subject that I absolutely adored. And I learned a little bit alongside the children to start with, and could really empathize with why some children find maths tricky and how we can help them to overcome those barriers. And ironically, actually, I found English, which is my passion, well, was my passion. I found that slightly harder to teach because I just intrinsically knew things about English, like where you would put a full stop, it goes at the end of a sentence. Why wouldn't you put it there? But I found that a little bit harder to teach why a sentence was a sentence, for instance. Whereas with maths, it all made a lot more sense as I began teaching it. So from there, really, the rest is history. I started working with the maths hubs, became a teaching for mastery specialist, then started working with the NCETM on the school development lead program, and I'm a facilitator on that still currently. And then just this year, I've started working with Twinkl as a national education lead for primary maths, which has just allowed me to spend all day, every day, thinking about maths and how we lead change in school and make that change sustainable. Just to link back round to our topic today. Yeah, that's how I've come to be kind of where I am now.
So much to unpack there. I don't know if I spoke about this with Pete last week, but the idea that people who have known the struggle of mathematics sometimes make the best subject leaders. So I'm thinking in my mind, there's we could spend the next couple of hours talking about that alone. But Maybe there's an episode where I take some people who've been a bit reticent about taking on the role of
Yeah,
subject leader,
absolutely.
etc.
I mean, I've worked with some people who were brilliant at maths at school and also excellent maths teachers. But also, I think you're right. I think there can be something about overcoming that barrier yourself. One of the things I've been thinking about a lot recently, actually, is adults in school and maths anxiety and reticence to work in upper key stage 2 in primary schools, often because of the maths. Often the maths is the thing that is put forward as, I don't want to teach year 6 maths. And you think, these teachers, you've all got GCSEs in maths, you've worked way beyond year 6, and yet that still can be a bit of a barrier for adults as well. So I'm thinking a little bit about how we overcome that stigma as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's also, it's a coincidence that you and Peter both been on 2 weeks in a row. That wasn't intentional, and certainly not being given huge sums of money to, to do so.
No.
But because we were talking before I started talking to Peter, it just happened that the diary sort of aligned because yours was very busy week last week, as was mine after
Yeah.
my conversation with
Yeah.
Pete.
Yeah. No, it's just the way it's worked out, isn't it? He jumped in ahead of me, and yeah, I waved a fist at him, but he's very welcome. It was a really good episode.
I thought so. I thought, yeah, I think lots of people have really enjoyed it and sort of let me know that they have. So it's
That's good.
fantastic. Because it could have been a 5 hour conversation easily. We're going to focus our attention on your sort of primarily the work you've done in your schools and also with the NCETM. And we're going to focus on meaningful change and sustaining change, which is something that's played on my mind because I often think it's the sustaining element that needs work, so to speak. But obviously, I can't paint too broad a stroke. How can we lay the foundations for meaningful change?
Great question. And to paint an analogy to start with, I think sustaining change is difficult in life generally. And I know, as a man who has gained a lot of weight and lost a lot of weight and run a lot of races and not being able to run for more than 10 yards without keeling over, that you can make positive changes, but sustaining those changes can be difficult because life gets in the way. And I think that's true in schools and other organizations as well. You start off on a path, and then you see positive things, and then something comes along and diverts you from that. So it is difficult to sustain positive change sometimes. And I think you've already hit the nail on the head, Kieran, when you talk about the foundations for that change being really important. So a lot of the work that we do with the NCETM on the school development lead, which is aimed towards maths, but is not, I don't think it's limited to maths in any way at all. A lot of that is based on the Education Endowment Fund's implementation guide, which is all evidence-backed and research-based, obviously, as all the EEF's great work tends to be. And they have updated that in 2024, I think. There used to be what they talked about an implementation cycle. They've changed the wording on it slightly to an implementation process, which I think is indicative of the fact that we need to see this as an ongoing process and not once around the cycle and we're done. I think that's an important sort of cog in the mechanism of making sure that change remains sustained. One of the things I think schools struggle with, certainly in my experience more than almost anything else, if you take money out of the equation, is time. And change is often sparked or prompted by an external factor, somebody coming in, whether that's Ofsted or a trust school improvement team or a head teacher or governors, whatever it might be, who identify an issue. Often that's data-led, but not always. And there then becomes a bit of a time-driven need to enact change quickly. And in my experience, that means that change isn't always delivered in the best way that it possibly could be. So I think that the first thing to understand about delivering sustainable changes that you need to factor in more time than you would think. A bit like on grand designs, when everybody thinks they're going to build the house in 12 months and then you see them 2 years later living in a caravan at Christmas. You need time, and it will take longer than you think. If you are familiar with the implementation process from the EEF, there's 4 main stages to it. It starts with explore, moves into the prepare phase, then the deliver, and then the sustain elements. Again, in my experience working with dozens of schools, I think in most cases where I've seen things implemented that haven't stuck, there has probably not been sufficient time given over to the explore phase to really unpick what the issue is that we're trying to address. So just going back to why we're doing this, somebody's come in and said your year 2 reading data shows that there's a dip in year 2 or in year 3. So you need to do something about that. Well, that to me is a symptom of a problem. The data shows as a symptom. It doesn't necessarily show us what the actual issue is. So there needs to be a concerted effort to spend some time getting under the root cause of the issue, and spending some time, as I say, figuring that out. And you might do various things during that phase. It could be learning walks, it could be looking at data, it could be book looks, talking to children, having informal conversations with teachers. I think is one of the best ways of finding out what's really happening in classrooms, because everybody's aware that sometimes there's a change of tone or pace or things when you walk into a classroom, but talking to the children and talking to the teachers as well can give you a really good indication of what's working, what it looks like now, and what needs there are at the pupil level, because that's where we want the focus to be, is on delivering this change for the benefit of the pupils. So really trying to understand that. Sometimes having an objective point of view from an external visitor can be helpful if they come in without an agenda. So again, sometimes there's a rush to find a fix, and somebody might suggest something, and you may end up with a salesperson coming to pay the school a visit, essentially, who has the solution to all your problems. They might have the solution to the problems. The problem is that until you've done the exploratory phase of the work, you don't know if that's a suitable fix for the problem in your setting, in your context. So, as I say, really trying to find out what the problem is, and then also trying to understand what your context is as a school, because every school, it's a cliche, but every school is different, and there are different needs, different cultures within the school that are really important, different members of staff, or different resources. So understanding where you are right now and what the real root cause of the problem is fundamental. So that explore phase might take half a term, might take a term. Be prepared for this to be a longer process than the governors or the head or the school improvement team might immediately wish for. But your response to that is probably going to be, we want to make sure this is done right, and we're going to try and do it right so that it lasts.
That's a key thing to find out when you're joining a new school, or before you agree to join a new school, is what is the approach to sort of school development, school improvement, because it's if you're given that time, I often find things happen more rapidly because that, I don't know, is there a metaphor where the soil is prepared properly, and then whereas if you're rushing things, you're going to get pretty.
I've been watching Clarkson's Farm recently, and I can absolutely take that metaphor. Have it done expertly and have it done properly the first time, and then you might get some fruits or wheat at the end of it. I like that, Kieran.
Yeah, because I was watching Lloyd Williams-Jones speak at Research Ed Kent at the weekend, and he was talking about the journey that he's been on over the last 5 years as deputy, and obviously he's now got into headship. And he was talking about the change he's going to make sure that governors and sort of key people within the trust are aware of just how long things are going to take. Because, you know, if you're changing your approach to curriculum, your approach to reading alone would take all of your effort. You're maybe not going to get your art curriculum, are you, for a while?
No.
But if everybody knows that, it's easier to get on
And
with.
and these things come with good intentions, don't they? Because you want to make the difference for the children that you have right now. You know, there's always that pressure that these children are in your care and in your supervision and under your guidance right now, and you want to do the very best for them. But I think there's a real argument that spending a little bit more time is doing the best thing for them, actually, and in the long run, that will benefit them. But being aware of that pressure before you start the process and how you're going to engage with those stakeholders who want to see changes now, I think is really important.
You've set the scene perfectly. You know, I can see exactly how we should approach this, how people who are working in really effective schools will be approaching this. How can we ensure that the changes we make, the improvements we make, are sustained?
Well, once we know what the problem is and we've set the scene, we know we've got a really good picture objectively of where we are as a school right now. And this is the sort of work that I do when I work with schools as a school development lead. That whole first visit, which might be a full day, is spent really trying to understand the school context. And I can't do all of that in a day either. I'm working with leaders to make sure that work continues after I leave. Once that's done, and you know you're relatively clear on what the problem really is, then the next stage really is the prepare phase, and that is something that often gets brushed over as well. But that is your opportunity to work with other stakeholders and mostly teachers, to be honest, to make sure that you've got that buy-in from them that this is the right way forward. Because we all know that in schools, things can change quite quickly, and you can get an email one night saying that I want something done differently as of next week or whatever. And that can be frustrating. I understand that. I've been there. I feel it. So preparing the ground with staff as well is equally important. And so to do that, you need to be absolutely clear on why you are doing what you are doing, what the next step is, and to make sure that you're doing the right thing and to be able to have that clarity. I think it's important to conduct some research into how other schools in similar settings might have approached this particular problem, because you know, the last school that I worked at was a lovely 2-form entry, leafy suburban school. A lot of the schools that I work with are, as a school development lead, because I'm in Derby, they are rural Derbyshire schools. Literally, one school that I was with last week, absolutely fantastic school. It's got 18 children, EYFS to year 6. Now, to try and implement anything that I've done in my school into that setting just wouldn't be appropriate. So spend the time to find out what's happening in other schools. Look at the evidence. Look at the research-based evidence. There's lots of resources for that, including a fantastic podcast that you're on, the Thinking Deeply About Primary Education podcast. I can hardly recommend, but lots and lots of resources for finding out what's happening in schools at the moment, what's working, and at that point bring the staff in and get that buy-in by involving them collaboratively in the process of designing the next steps. Because what you really want to avoid is a fait accompli, you know, as the literacy lead or the head teacher or the maths lead or whatever, this is what we're going to do next, this is why we're doing it, that's great, but if staff don't feel that they've been involved in that process, it can feel very much that it's being done to them, and it becomes another job to do rather than a process that they're involved in and invested in. So yeah, preparing the ground, finding the right solution to the problem, whether that's something that you buy in or a change to pedagogy or a change to lesson design, whatever that might be, bringing staff along with you is I would say critical. And then the next two stages are deliver and sustain. Now, deliver is all the things that you've thought about during prepare, which might be how you're going to upskill staff if they need it, what professional development you might run to make sure this change is implemented well, what resources you might need to buy, what time needs to be given over, and also during that preparatory phase, how you're going to monitor the implementation of it, not just the outcomes, but whether it's working well, whether staff are on board with it, whether it's being done, and what impact ultimately it's happening. And I think in my experience, if that hasn't been planned for, that sort of monitoring, it can be very easy to just be a tick box. Yes, this is being done. Great, move on. Whereas actually what we want to see is the positive impacts from it, which may take some time to show. If I think about implementing teaching for mastery at my school, that took 6 years really to be fully implemented, and then through the ongoing monitoring and the sustaining of that took further work and further effort to continue to refine it, to change things as we found that some bits were working for this cohort and other bits weren't. And so that final sort of sustain process, I think, is about recognizing from your monitoring what's working really well, what can be refined further, and then almost going back through that process again to continue to refine it. I mentioned earlier, I'm somebody who has run half marathons and also not being able to run to the lamppost at the end of the street. And every time I get in that latter state, I think, why did I not just continue doing the things that are working? But it can be hard because sometimes you're distracted by other things. Life gets in the way and things. The only way that I found to continue to be half bothered with running is to have a plan that I stick to and that is mapped out and that I can monitor and see whether I'm improving or not, or not improving, and then make tweaks accordingly. And I think it's exactly the same when it comes to school improvement. You need to continue to have a plan. That implementation plan that you've designed after your explore phase and your prepare phase needs to extend beyond that deliver, and really have some meat on the bones of how you are going to continue to keep those particular plates spinning, and that they won't be derailed by the next initiative that comes along.
Do your schools ever think about succession planning as part of that? Because something that I see, or certainly I think is quite prevalent, is the idea that sometimes these changes, these improvements, this approaches can be tied to an individual. But like, I imagine your last school, your hope would be that when you left as maths lead, things are still going. Like my last official school, things are still taking over because it was the way things happened there and because key leaders are still there. Like, do you ever get that far with your schools, or are they thinking about the lifetime of when they're at the school?
That's a really good point. And I think what it alludes to is, how do you, over time, build the culture of that school so that the change that you have implemented just becomes part of what we do. It's the way that maths is taught at that school, or it's the way that reading is taught at that school, and it doesn't rely on one person ensuring that continues. Again, that takes time, but part of, I think, that sustain process is thinking about your staff, the people that are engaged in this. Who can I identify who may need some further support? Who's doing it really, really well that we can show off? Who could lead some PD for the other staff? Who could be involved in championing this? Certainly, at my last school, I had I put in maths champions, we called them, in each each phase. So one in early years, one in year 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Who I met with fairly regularly, and we all agreed that this was the way forward. Because, as I say, it was a medium-sized school. There was a lot of staff, some part-time staff and things. It could be hard to get a message across a whole staff body, if you are one person trying to do it in a staff meeting. I think we can agree at this point that PD doesn't just happen in staff meetings, and that the things that happen outside of those are really important. So you're absolutely right. If you can change that intangible culture of the school so that what you're doing is ingrained in it, which is not to say that nothing ever changes, but part of that intangible thing that is ingrained is a desire to keep making sure that we're doing the right thing, keep making sure this is best practice, not change everything for the sake of it. I see this quite a lot, and sorry to go back to maths for a moment, but I see this quite a lot with schemes of work, for instance. A school will have a scheme of work that they've invested in, that they have bought into, that they are using day to day. Somebody will suggest that maybe the maths data could be better. And almost one of the first reactions is, well, I wonder what scheme out there will make that happen. And I don't know, I hope you agree, that there are some schemes are better suited to certain settings than others, absolutely. But the skill of the teacher is in adapting that resource and delivering it in a way that works in that context and in that setting. And that no scheme that you buy is going to immediately improve everything, overnight. That's not how it works. So being prepared to alter things to fit your setting, because you know really clearly, because you've done all that work on objectively what your context needs and what the children in your context need. Hopefully that sort of approach becomes ingrained over time, and you don't need to keep chopping and changing things to see long-term sustainable improvements.
Yeah, no, I'm totally with you. There's like almost like a symbiotic relationship between the professional development that's in place and the curriculum. The only curriculum I know that changes things overnight is the one that I've written and I'm now selling. Obviously that's the outlier.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and obviously at Twinkl we've got a range of fantastic. I mean, genuinely, we've got some fantastic resources, but how they are used is in the skill of the teacher, and that's why you're a teacher. It's not to deliver something that's been purchased by the head of department or the maths lead. It's to teach the children in front of you, and what we want to do, I suppose, is to make that process as efficient and enjoyable and the best it possibly can be.
Yeah, when I talk to like maths leaders, because like my maths help work in Kent is typically with schools who are putting systems in place before they engage with teaching for mastery. And I always say to them, whatever you've got in place has to align with your vision for mathematics, because there will be a way to implement various different curricula that will be different and distinct. And I mean, perhaps less so in England in 2025, but I always talk about if you go to different states in America, you can have within counties different versions of the same textbook because the model is different and stuff. So it really, because you're going to be spending so much time trying to make things better in school, if you're totally in like there's a juxtaposition between what you want for maths, what you hope your children will get for maths, and what the sort of resources you're utilizing do. That's almost, you're not going to put half as much effort in, are you? So I can no. Totally see where you're coming from. So I mean, there were two other things that actually stood out to me with the ownership one, and I don't know the answer to this, and it really is context specific in my experience whenever I've sort of addressed these things. But when you're providing ownership for teachers within the process, what do you do? What do you recommend people do whenever their suggestions are so far left field as to really being sitting in opposition to what you're trying to establish? What's the tactful way to deal with that?
That is a great question, and it's one that you come across when you're working with schools, but also within your own school. There's usually a member of staff who is quite rightly willing to challenge what you're suggesting, and actually I think it can be the sign of a healthy school culture if staff feel safe enough to be able to actually question why we're doing this and is this the best way of doing it? I'm with you, Kieran, that it does depend a little bit on context and setting. But the thing that I always go back to is, have I delivered clarity of vision and clarity of why we're doing this? Because if after everything that we've done, somebody's still asking, well, is this the best way to do it? That probably reflects on my, it could be that they weren't listening, but otherwise it probably reflects on my delivery of why we're doing this and the clarity around it. One of the first things when I first started working in school improvement, probably 12 years ago, was somebody said to me, the most important thing that you can give is clarity. You've got to be really, really clear on why something is being done, and that it's why it's in the best interest of the pupils. And at that point, it would be unusual for somebody to I'm not saying it wouldn't happen, but it would be unusual for somebody to challenge on that. And if they do, then you've got that in your pocket to say, well, just go back to, this is why we're doing it. And the suggestion, might be something that we look at again if during part of that monitoring of this, if we find that actually, with all the best intentions, what we're doing isn't working, then we can consider other options. But we've worked together as a staff to come up with this way forward. It's not somebody external coming in and saying, this is what you must do, because I think that's where those conversations tend to happen most often. Or when, again, just the maths context, a maths lead has been on a course and comes back and says, well, this is what we're doing now, whole school. And somebody in year 6 says, well, that won't work for the year 6s, and somebody in EYFS says, well, that's not going to work for us. Sorry to keep harking on about it, but that whole explore phase and prepare phase, if you brought everybody along with you on the journey from that point, I think you're less likely to have those conversations. They still happen because some people are reluctant to change, and that can be difficult to manage. But hopefully you won't be the only one trying to manage that in a school setting.
Yeah, as I asked the question, I started then thinking about individual specific interactions, and that point on having to be the best version of when you're explaining, and really testing your own thinking and pushing the boundaries and stuff, I think it really resonates,
Yeah. And as I say, it can be a sort. I remember working with a member of staff who had an ECT join the school, and they had a meeting with the ECT, which was great practice, I think. They were a maths lead. They explained to the ECT, this is how we teach maths at this school. This is the format. This is how we the lesson progresses. These are the resources, and the teacher that she was working with sort of immediately said, well, that seems like a lot of work. Why don't we just put the PowerPoint on the screen and give the children the questions? And you could react to that with exasperation and frustration, and or you could react to it and say, well, actually, here's an opportunity to explain why we don't do that and why this is best practice. And yes, you're right, there is a degree of workload here, although I would argue that when I first started teaching, I had to do 6 different tasks in every single lesson for differentiation and things, that there was a degree of workload there as well. That is part of the job. And again, this is why we do it. This is why we do it. We know that this works. If you're starting something new, we've got evidence that this works elsewhere, and we want to trial it here.
Yeah, kids these days don't know what workload means.
They don't know they're born.
But because that really comes to mind is that as a leader, it's taking away all the other things. And I've been meaning to look and see if there's a teacher tap sort of survey on some of the meaningless things that happen in school. Because your first job as leader should be to get rid of those, so you can then have more time to do the things that are more likely to be impacted, like the thinking about your maths lesson or your preparation of your sort of representations of your sequence or whatever, and I think that's huge and equally part of that initial phase. Can I lay the groundwork in terms of taking away triple marking, or I mean, that probably.
Yeah, I completely agree. And there was, I don't know if you saw the NEU report that came out during their conference. Are you on slide 8 yet? That was all about schemes of work again, and teacher autonomy, and teachers feeling that they're being micromanaged. I say teachers, I think it was 38% of respondents or something felt that way, but it's a large minority feel that they're being micromanaged. And you need freedom, I would say, within the classroom as the teacher to be able to teach the way that your children need to be taught within the framework that's been agreed as a school, because you've got that consistency of approach. And it's one of those questions I've been talking to people about recently, is where do you find the balance between consistency of approach, because you want children to have a linear journey as much as possible through school, where they're going to come out across the same procedures that just reduce some of that cognitive load, or in maths representations and things that they're already familiar with. How do you balance that with not micromanaging, or saying that every lesson has to have this 7-part design, or wherever we're up to now with the number of parts of lessons and things. And it is tricky, because as a leader, you want to make sure that things are being done in the right way, but equally you've got skilled professionals in the classroom, and we need to give them some freedom to work within the sort of approach that you've agreed upon together.
The actual implementation, what sort of approaches do your schools take? Because, like, in my mind, the ideal involves a lot of subject leader time not in class. And I know that cover probably has never been as sort of difficult as it is now. What sort of coping strategies or sort of workarounds are schools that you're working with use, or what did you use, and how did you make that time? Because it was the point about going beyond the staff meeting. You do the initial training, but everything else that happens after that is going to dictate whether or not this is an impactful change.
It's a good question, and increasingly we're finding it's very difficult to release staff for any sort of CPD or meetings or anything else. And there's obviously lots of reasons for that we don't need to go into. But boxing clever is a cliche, but again, giving yourself enough time that you're not trying to do this all in the space of 2 weeks, because that will really put the pressure on in terms of having to get everything done very quickly. But if you are doing this as a staff, and if it's a whole school priority, because it's been identified as such, and that's why you're going through this process, I think where you can look for opportunities to work together as a staff, so things like coaching trios and things like that, where you can release one another to go and watch people's lessons, or to give feedback, or to, I don't want to say working lunches, because everybody deserves a lunchtime, but those informal conversations that I mentioned earlier, they can happen in the staff room. That's probably one of the best places for them to happen, is in the staff room, just catching people, and those conversations happen organically anyway, don't they? I've been lucky that some members of SLT in schools have been willing to step into the class for an hour to release people to go and do learning walks, or talk to children, or do those things. When I mentioned earlier about making sure that there's buy-in from the staff, I think that buy-in needs to involve SLT as well. If you're not part of SLT, or even if you are, making it a priority with the head teacher, or the executive head teacher, or whoever might be able to help, is really important. Because as you say, we've all been there as a subject lead, where you're being asked to do things and you've not got the time to do them, and it can be really, really difficult. So working with other people as much as possible. But I don't have a magic wand for how to get more release time from nowhere, unfortunately. I wish I did. I'd sell that, definitely.
I think it was a solid response. Like I say, boxing clever. Like I say, I've not necessarily heard that for a long time, but it makes total sense. And I think It is a shame the system in some elements has to be propped up by the goodwill of teachers and things. But hopefully something will change in the near future.
There is an element of that, and I know as a maths lead, I was really passionate about wanting to implement things that I knew would have a positive impact, and that meant that I did spend time that I wasn't being paid for doing things. I'm not saying that's the right approach, and I totally also understand anybody who says no. Actually, when I started, I didn't have children, I didn't have a family. My evenings, my wife was a teacher, so we were both sat there working. As I've grown older and things, I can totally understand and respect people's boundaries. And therefore, you need to find ways wherever possible of making things happen within school, within the school day, or immediately afterwards if you've got some time just after school. But breaking things up and not thinking that it has to be a whole day out of class to work on this, I think can help. If you've got a head teacher who's willing to come in for half an hour at the end of the day, or I was talking to a head recently actually who just loves maths, loves teaching, and she all the way through her headship has taught 2 maths lessons a week, one to year 5 and one to year 6. And generally she has the teacher still in the classroom with her at that point. But she said it's also an opportunity to free up key members of staff if I need to go and do those things. So if you've got somebody who is able to do that, I think that's worth their weight in gold.
For all of you Kofi, Ko-Fi, Ko-Fu-Fu, however you pronounce it, you damn lovely supporters. It's a song going out to you, to you. Okay, here we go. Nikki, Anna P, Seb D, Stephanie Taylor, Mrs. B, Esatea, Adam, Katie, Liv, MC, Becca, Jenford, Susie, Brown, andCio, Netchio, Rachel, I am Al, Jessica, Tom Oakley, Tom Brassington, Jessica, Tom Oakley, Tom Brassington, LJ, and last but not least, my lovely little Amy Bill. So they help us pay the bills. So a massive thank you out to Dappy family. Coffee supporters help us keeping it ad free. There's far more content coming just round the bend. Thank you all for helping our very special friends. Friends. Very special friends.
What pitfalls should we avoid when making changes in school, and without them just being the opposite of the implementation process?
Yeah. The biggest pitfall that I see, and I'm trying really hard not to say the obvious things that we've just talked about, I suppose. The biggest pitfalls are not allowing things to bed in and to decide after sometimes less than a term that actually there's 2 things here. One is it really may not be working for you. It really may not be working in your setting. And I think it is important to acknowledge that if that's the case, if it really, so a school I was working with recently, they wanted to do teaching for mastery. They are not currently in the place to implement that as things stand at the moment. And to force that on them would be completely the wrong approach. It would do more harm than good. And so you might say, there's all this research that shows that this is the best way forward. But actually, in their context, where they are staff-wise, resource-wise, time-wise, capacity, mental, emotional, everything else, we're working with people, and you need to respect that and bear that in mind, I think. And so I think sometimes just ploughing on, regardless of what the feedback is, can be really detrimental to implementing change that is truly going to be sustainable. So that's definitely one of those things, is not listening to the feedback and not, I suppose, having preconceived ideas. So that's what happens quite often. And you'll know, Kieran, maths hubs, they have preconceived ideas of how maths should be taught, because that's what they're all about. But I think most mastery specialists that you work with will also be able to recognize contextual circumstances and actually, yes, this is the gold standard, but this is where we are at the moment on a particular journey. So if you have somebody coming into school saying this is the right way, this is what you've got to do right now, start tomorrow, that for me is a huge red flag and something to be avoided. Other pitfalls, I think, are not planning beyond the delivery. So not having systems in place and developing systems that mean that this is going to be maintained and checked and refined and explored and monitored.
The not listening to feedback is crucial, because I can imagine, I can remember times when I've not necessarily listened to feedback, and
we're all guilty of it.
Things haven't gone to plan. So I think that's absolutely gold advice, because we can get really swept up, particularly those of us who are researching or engaged and sort of learning all these new things from conferences and stuff, and then we're so enthusiastic in the classroom. And I would say I'm talking about me. And then I've been so enthusiastic, and then I've not necessarily gone at this. I've been going at breakneck speed, not. So I think that's definitely, other than the inverse of everything you've sort of very carefully outlined in this episode, it is very much about actually listening, isn't it, and actually thinking, rather than it's on the plan.
I think you can get caught up, can't you, in your, as you say, your own enthusiasm, your own desire to change things, and also sometimes in your own little bubble as a school of this is what's going to work here and this is where we are, and actually you might not be able to recognize without taking a step back where you really are. So that objective point of view can be really helpful, and that's where, if you have got somebody who can come in and work with you who doesn't necessarily have something to sell you, that can be hard to find. But other head teachers or people from organisations like the Maths Hub, if you've got people who can come in and give you some objective points of view and guidance, that can be invaluable.
So, I mean, I think, like I said, to go back to finish off on Lloyd's thing, he talks about the idea of October to May being your sort of, this is where most of your implementation and your change is going to happen. So anyone listening to this episode isn't going to try and change things on Monday, but this is something really good food for thought for laying the groundwork in September and then hitting the ground running in October.
You could begin to explore what things are currently like now, but without thinking about change. Although, what things are currently like right now in June or July might be a little bit different to typical sports days and sports events and post-sats, whatevers.
Yeah, residentials, reports, parents' evenings. It's a wonder.
All the good stuff. I know. Yeah. Anything but teaching. Yeah.
Well, I've massively enjoyed this. It's been an absolute pleasure. I'll just let through to say thank you very much for joining me, Jon.
No, it's been a pleasure. I've really enjoyed talking to you, Kieran. Thank you very much.
And to everyone at home, until next time, thanks for listening.